African human rights scene, having served on the Nigerian Human Rights Commission and helped found the African Court of Human and People's Rights. A lawyer and an academic, he was once described as a leading member of the new generation of African legal minds. It is, of course, an immense pleasure to welcome you, Professor Odinkalu. Thank you so much for joining us. These amazing panelists will kindly share their insights about the topic we have at hand today for about 15 to 20 minutes. They will then have a discussion about the global Black Lives Matter movement and global anti-Blackness. And then we will be moving on to a Q&A session where I will be asking some questions, but I also urge you as an audience to please bring in your own questions, so please try to keep them in mind as you listen to these wonderful panelists. So I will now invite Dr. Rosado to share her expertise and ideas on global anti-Blackness and anti-racism or anti-racist movements. Thank you so much.
Good evening, everyone. How are y'all doing? Awake? The food was good, right?
Yeah.
It's like that carrot cake. That's so nice to meet you. So let's go ahead and get started. So as Saif has pointed out, I am part of, I'm a co-PI of a project called Insurgent Intersections, Combating Global Anti-Blackness in the Africana Studies Department. And the project really tries to bring together scholars, artists, and activists to create new knowledge that will help us tackle, challenge, eradicate anti-Blackness. So let's go ahead and get started. So as Saif pointed out, 2020 marked a rupture, if you will, a moment where globally people started paying attention to anti-Blackness and its ramifications, its impacts. Now, anti-Blackness had already been happening for centuries, right? This was not something new, but the murder of George Floyd really it created an impact, a ripple effect across the world, where it seemed like people were waking up, right? People were waking up and acknowledging these issues. And so you have, from Minneapolis, where I lived a couple years, so this was wild to see it unfold, from Minneapolis to the rest of the U.S., folks saying Black Lives Matter, Black Lives Matter. But this movement had been going on for so long, This movement started in 2012 after the murder of Trayvon Martin, and there were flashpoints throughout the murder of Michael Brown, the murder of Eric Gardner, the murder of Philando Castile, you name it, right? The names continue and continue. So it was a flashpoint that was surprising to me as someone who had been involved in the movement since 2013, that this was the moment that caused people to really wake up. I was like, why didn't this happen in 2014? Why didn't this happen in 2016? What is it about 2020 that caused people to wake up? It was just fascinating. So we saw, the spreading out of Black Lives Matter around the world, which took a number of different forms. In Bristol, England, I think there's a pointer here. In Bristol, England, you see over here that folks were protesting, and they ended up toppling and throwing into a river or a body of water the statue of Edward Colston, who was a member of the Royal African Company, which transported thousands of slaves from Africa annually during the mid and late 17th century. Then you had here you can see in Puerto Rico, you have people protesting for Black Lives Matter. There was also a vigil for Black Lives Matter for George Floyd in Loíza, Puerto Rico, which is a majority Black Puerto Rican town. In Brazil, you had protests against police brutality, and in Brazil, it's a really interesting case because the rate of police killings of Black people is actually higher than it is here in Brazil. So the issue of police brutality is and has been a major issue throughout Brazil, and so they took up the mantle. And in the last photo here, you see folks in Bogotá, Colombia, also protesting under the banner of Black Lives Matter with, a sign that says #No puedo respirar, I cannot breathe, right? I can't breathe. So while this movement, right, spread out and people used a lot of the terms, a lot of the language that emerged from Black movements here in the US, it took different forms depending on the countries that folks were protesting in. So they were saying Black Lives Matter, but the issues affecting Black people in these places varied, right? They all had the underlying structure of anti-Blackness, but they differed in significant ways, in important ways. So we noticed, myself and my two colleagues, Akisi Britton and Kim Butler, who are the other co-PIs of the project, we noticed that in the wake of 2020, something happened. People were first protesting anti-Blackness. They were protesting against police brutality, specifically against Black people, right? And then that started morphing into this language of a reckoning on race. We're experiencing a reckoning on race. We're reckoning with race. And it turned into something that was very not specific to anti-Blackness. It turned into something that was just like, we're trying to talk about race. Well, there's a difference between talking about race and talking about anti-Blackness. And so this is something that for us really resonated, because using the language of racial reckoning, racial justice writ large, in this context does a lot of work to sort of water down the issue, right? To kind of water down the specificity of anti-Blackness and how long of a history anti-Blackness has in the world. And so we were upset with this. We were like, we need to intervene. We need to do something, right, to bring back that specificity. And so we started developing this project, right? We started developing this project in 2021. And we developed it because of that loss of specificity of anti-Blackness in those broader calls for reckoning on race. And we also developed it because Africana studies in particular, it helps to show how anti-Blackness is not only evident in police brutality, but how at a more like deeper level, racial inequities continue to be so pervasive despite anti-racist legislation, the election of Black politicians, institutional interventions like DEI, right? All of these things have still not led to a significant dent in terms of what Black people are facing globally. So we decided to develop this project, and we have, several interventions, several things that we kind of take as important points. So the first is that we need to be specific about anti-Blackness. Racial justice, absolutely incredible. We need to fight for that too, right? But when we stop talking about anti-Blackness, there's a way that we can lose the conversation on anti-Blackness. And so we wanted to be specific. Second, we have to be global in our approach, right? So this is not just about people globally being in solidarity with the US, which is how some people perceived Black Lives Matter globally as like, oh, they're in solidarity with the US. No, this is also about Black people around the world who are fighting for their humanity to be recognized and valued, right? Anti-Blackness has always been global. It's always been global, right? Any country that has been touched by the slave trade, colonialism, imperialism has seen anti-Blackness. And obviously, since the migration of people around the globe, it's become even more global in nature. So Africana studies, because we focus on the African diaspora, is well suited for interrogating these issues. And while, I was trained as a sociologist, I'm totally a convert to Africana studies and absolutely love the discipline. So I think that we are well positioned to study these things. Another thing that we wanted to emphasize is that anti-Blackness is not new, right? It's existed as long as colonialism and slavery, and perhaps even a little bit before that. Also, we wanted to emphasize, again, that anti-Blackness is not just about police brutality. And an important point here that I mention this a lot to my students, is that when we focus only on Black people as Black bodies being subject to violence, we can further dehumanize Black people. We are ignoring the complexities of the interior lives of Black people by doing that. We're ignoring the communal lives of Black people. We're ignoring their creative and, wonderful creations in the world, right? So while it's absolutely critical to address anti-Black violence, it's also important to kind of take a more holistic approach and not just look at that.
And then lastly, that we need to be intersectional, right? That we can't just look at race solely as like a singular axis of oppression without considering how it intersects with other axes of oppression. Sexism, classism, xenophobia, ableism, you name it. So those are all important to us. So how did we decide to address these issues? First, we wanted to go beyond the academy. So again, talking to artists and activists to create knowledge. We also wanted to center Black feminist approaches to knowledge production, which is, centered on dialogue and praxis, and not so much on these ideas of objective knowledge production, right? Or Eurocentric ideas of what counts as truth, right? We wanted to destabilize those things. And we wanted to go beyond those quick fixes, right? And we wanted to dig deeper. As much as universities love to create statements around, police brutality and Black Lives Matter, how many of those initiatives or those letters ended up in actual policy changes at universities? How many DEI offices actually work to eradicate anti-Blackness on college campuses, right? These are questions that we want to ask. So we decided to make this a 4-year project where we are exploring 4 themes. And so I'm going to go through those themes quickly, and then I'm going to end by giving you 3 examples of how I see anti-Blackness occurring in Latin America, which is where I do my work. So the first theme is the roots of global anti-Blackness. Here we're focused on the long history of anti-Blackness. It requires getting to the root of the issue. So here we focus on slavery, obviously its ties to capitalism. We focus on how Blackness was created as the opposite, the polar opposite of whiteness in order to justify the exploitation of Africans and their descendants' labor. We focus on revolutions, right? So the importance of the Haitian Revolution for understanding anti-Blackness around the world, right? As that kind of like a critical point in history that impacted African descendants almost everywhere in the Americas. And we also focus on abolition, right? What that looks like after slavery is outlawed. The second theme that we look at is the mechanisms. So that's the theme that we're working on this year. And this theme is focused on processes and structures. So how does anti-Blackness work on the ground? How can it be embedded in practices, policies, and institutions? How can even Black people practice anti-Blackness, right? Knowingly or unknowingly, which is a thing that happens, right? And here we're focused on being in dialogue with activists, doing the work on the ground, right? Because they have to address those mechanisms in order to undo anti-Blackness. Then we will get into solidarities and lived experiences of anti-Blackness, and that's how people experience anti-Blackness on a day-to-day. What are the movements doing? What are people on the ground doing? And also the solidarities part is asking how are other communities who are not Black but experience subjugation in some form, how are they in solidarity with Black people to collectively tackle their oppression? And the focus here is going to be more on dialogue with artists who have been using their creativity to explore internal and communal experiences of anti-Blackness. And then lastly, we're going to be talking about healing from anti-Blackness. Here we're focusing on self and community care. It's very important for us in doing this project that we not only focus on the problem, but we also focus on some solutions, right? And contrary to kind of like the solutions that are structural and institutional, which are incredibly important, we also need to heal from anti-Blackness on a personal level, on a communal level. If we don't engage in that healing, all the other work falls apart because we're starting from a place of just, we haven't processed the emotions related to anti-Blackness. So one of the things that we're gonna look at there is, what are Black people's strategies to survive and thrive amid anti-Blackness? What strategies and practices do we need to tap into so that Black people can effectively tackle the impacts of anti-Blackness? And here we want to close out with a conference where we use direct methods. So we don't want to only talk about how Black people need to rest more. We actually want to have like napping sessions as part of the conference. We don't want to talk about how our bodies are affected and that's it. We want to have Reiki, we want to have massages, we want to do the direct methods, right? Actually do the work of healing as part of the conference. So engaging in that praxis. Okay, so that's the project. If you have questions about any of it, I'm glad to answer them. But I wanted to close out by giving you 3 examples of anti-Blackness, right? How this looks like globally, what this looks like globally. So my work is in Latin America. I do research on Puerto Ricans and Dominicans, mostly in the US, but transnational in a lot of ways. So one of the things that I've noticed in my research on Blackness in Latin America is that oftentimes Blackness is seen as outside of the nation, as not existing as part of the nation. And that's because the nation, a nationhood in many Latin American countries, has been constructed around the centrality of a mixed race community peoples, right? So we're not black, white, whatever, we're all Puerto Rican, we're all Dominican, we're all Brazilian, whatever it may be, right? But it's that centering of a mixed race identity that actually makes it harder for Black Latin Americans to fight for justice. Right? How are you going to fight against racism when racism doesn't exist, supposedly, right? That's kind of the narrative. So let's start with Puerto Rico, which is where I'm from. So this is Loíza, Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico was colonized by the US, if you didn't know, in 1898. And many Puerto Ricans, including myself, feel like Puerto Rico is still a colony of the US, that relationship continues. So one of the things that happens in Puerto Rico that shows anti-Blackness is police brutality, the same as in the US. A lot of the policing practices, ideas of being tough on crime, approaches to crime mitigation, etc., have been exported to Puerto Rico, right? Because of the connection between the US and Puerto Rico. And so these practices disproportionately impact Black Puerto Ricans. But the thing that I want to focus on here is climate change and natural disasters, because this is something that impacts a lot of places in the Caribbean. So given the colonial relationship with the US, what happens is that when there is a natural disaster, there's often a process by which Puerto Rico gets neglected or gets kind of a second rank citizenship in relationship to the US. We saw this during Hurricane Maria in 2017. And one of the things that happens is that Loíza, right, which is a majority Black Puerto Rican town, largely impoverished, is experiencing the worst of it, right? When natural disasters happen, they experience the worst of it. In this photo, you see a woman in Loíza who's standing in her home 5 years after Hurricane Maria, and she hasn't received any help for her home. She hasn't received anything to even cover her roof, right, which blew off during the hurricane. You see here in the middle the impacts of Hurricane Fiona last year. And one of the things that happened is that Biden issued a major disaster declaration last year after the hurricane, but it excluded Loíza. As in 3 municipalities were excluded from that, and that included Loíza. And people are like, why? Why is Loíza excluded from this natural disaster declaration when clearly they have experienced the damages of the hurricane? And it wasn't until November 30th, right? Like 4 months later that they actually granted that emergency declaration to Loíza after people protested. Another example is Dominican Republic. So in Dominican Republic, we see anti-Blackness take the form of xenophobia mixed with anti-Blackness. And some of the roots of this stem from the Trujillo dictatorship, right? So Trujillo was in power for 31 years. In 1937, he ordered the massacre of Haitians along the border between DR and Haiti, and close to 30,000 people, mostly of Haitian descent, were murdered in that massacre. So fast forward to today, we're still seeing that xenophobia. We're still seeing those impacts. In 2013, a constitutional, I don't know what the exact term, so I'm just going to call it la sentencia, which is what folks call it. La sentencia was passed, which essentially revoked the birthright citizenship of undocumented Haitian migrants who were born between 1929 and 2007. 1929. And so what this did is it denationalized 4 generations of Dominican citizens, leaving 250,000 Haitian descendants stateless. Right? They weren't citizens of the DR, they weren't citizens of Haiti. Then last year, a new president came into power and everyone's like, oh, he's like a little bit more progressive, right? This is Luis Abinader. He's a little more progressive, great. He passed a decree that established a specialized unit aimed at preventing and prosecuting squatters of any private or public property. But what this unit did is it targeted batallas, which are the sugar plantations where mostly Haitian descendants cultivate sugarcane. And so they're targeting, right, specific areas to deport, Dominicans of Haitian descent, essentially. And so this regime, right, this anti-Black regime of deportation continues today, and folks have been protesting, right? They're calling it ethnic cleansing. They're saying, I'm Dominican just like you, right? Why are you trying to exclude me? Why are you trying to eliminate me from the country? And then the last example I want to give is Chocó, Colombia. So you see a map here of Colombia, and you see how they're darker areas. Those areas are ancestral Afro-Colombian lands. So in 1993, the Constitution of Colombia granted these lands to Afro-Colombians and said, you have rights over this land. You get to determine what happens here. But in practice, that actually didn't work in that way. What ended up happening is that now that those lands belong to Afro-Colombians, there wasn't a lot of state presence in that region, and so people saw it as an opportunity to try and get their land. And so a ton of displacement and violence has happened in this region because the land is rich in resources. And so it's an area that's been historically neglected, and now because it's been neglected, it actually has a lot of natural resources and is a prime target for people trying to engage in extraction, engage in essentially land theft for the purposes of profit. And lastly, one of the things that happens in Colombia is that folks have been protesting this for a long time, but they're now being targeted by gangs. They're being assassinated for trying to defend their land. And it's incredibly dangerous to be a Black activist in Colombia right now. But they're still protesting, and there's a lot of groups involved, including a lot of women-led groups in that region. Okay, I'm gonna leave it there. If you want to follow our work, you can scan this QR code, or you can email me or visit our website. Thank you so much for your attention and time.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rosado, for a beautiful presentation. I will now give the floor to Professor Odinkalu for another awesome presentation.
Wow.
I'm sure.
Okay. Hi, good evening. I should say thank you to begin with. It's an atrocious hour of day to be, particularly on a Friday, to have this kind of conversation that could be both mentally and psychologically intense. I should also, in saying that, file my mitigation. I am really characteristically suboptimal at this hour of the week. And so anyone who invites me to discuss anything at this particular hour must take personal responsibility for anything I say. I hereby therefore disown responsibility for anything I'm about to say, and in fact for how you receive it. So please don't hold me to account. If it comes out awkward, if it comes out just not particularly processed, it's got nothing to do with me. Now, but there are themes that are clearly common to Professor Rosado's presentation and mine, and therefore, for much of what I'm about to say, all I'm going to say is I hereby agree and I concur. And the first, I want to highlight 5 issues quite quickly, so that we also spare ourselves any violation of the constitutional prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. First of all, I think we've got to process a question. Are we dealing with causation, correlation, or coincidence? You know, Americans like to think that there are two countries in the world, or maybe three. You have the USA and you have the others. Those who are modestly generous try to make it the United States, Europe, and the others. And I hate to break it down to you, but that's part of the problem. And so there is a tendency, you know, people woke up in 2020 and remember there was a blackness issue around the world. And it started, so the history starts with George Floyd. But even in this country, the history obviously dates a heck of a lot further back, and methodologically, therefore, the historical dimension to Professor Rosado's presentation, I think, is very important. You know, a lot of the younger generation in this country will not remember Emmett Till, for instance, and that entire story. Of course, the MLK holiday kind of reminds people of a few things, but not quite enough. But I think the historical dimension is important, particularly in this country, but also in different ways outside this country. And so the tendency to construct a unified field theory, a global unified field theory of, or narrative of what I call the politics, the political economy of global pigmentation, I think is something that I am fairly reluctant to do. And that's the first premise that I want to lay down. The second thing I want to suggest is that in this we've got to be keenly aware of a global political economy in which the United States has been as much a force for ill, perhaps more than it's been a force for good, globally. There are two tendencies here historically. One was the commodification of the black person, of the black pigment, which gave us the strand of slavery. And the formal abolition of slavery globally is less than 100 years old. The Slavery Convention dates back to 1926 alone. That's 3 years less than 100 years, 97 years. Secondly, in addition and separate from the commodification of the black person, and capitalism is a series of commodifications, right? You've got commodification of land, and commodification of labor, and commodification of people, and now you've got commodification of our activities in datafication, right? Now, separate from these commodifications, you also had the occupation of black countries, and that gave you the post-industrial revolution colonialism. And we've got to look at these as two strands that are related, but not necessarily the same. Now, if we try to do that, we will see that the United States has played a role in both, in different ways that are not particularly very helpful globally. In terms of the politics of slavery, Dred Scott was influential, plus even more influential. South Africa introduced separate but equal in 1902 in response to Plessy, as a matter of fact, which happened 4 years before the turn of the century. And it was Plessy that ultimately led to racialization, the history of racialization of lands and then people in South Africa, okay? And Dred Scott, of course, led to the diminution of the black person globally, and that strain of jurisprudence has been influential across the board globally. And the United States, by the way, was one of the 14 countries present at the at the adoption of the Berlin-Finland Act on the 26th of February 1885, when the European powers decided to carve up the countries of Africa, draw lines in the sand, and decide where they were going to occupy. The straightest lines on a map in the world after Wyoming and Colorado are found in Africa. And those were drawn by people who could never ever locate Africa on a map. And the United States was witness to that, guaranteed it, and was happy to live by it. And of course, part of the atrocity from that was that the biggest piece of real estate on the African continent was parceled off to one man, King Leopold of Belgium, who went on to commit the worst atrocities humanity ever witnessed until the Second World War. And in terms of absolute numbers, much worse than the numbers that were produced by the Second World War. And the DRC has never been the same since King Leopold was allowed to lay hands on it. Quite apart from that, the international human rights movement, a lot of people forget, originated in Roger Casement's report on the atrocities of King Leopold in the Congo. Now, all of that feeds a global political economy of anti-blackness that has a transnational history that lots of people are willing, therefore, to engage with. And because of that, I come at this with some health warnings about a globalization of a narrative out of the situation we've got. But in the particular context of George Floyd and police atrocities and all of that, my reluctance firms up quite seriously. And why is that so? Policing is an enterprise with divergent origins and philosophies across the world. In 1829, Robert Peel founded the Metropolitan Police in the United Kingdom, and with it, what are called the Peelian principles. If anyone who studies policing will know of the notion of policing by consent. And so in the United Kingdom, you've got the notion of Bobby on the beat. And the Bobby on the beat does not carry any weapons. You know, it's supposed to be a neighborhood asset and does neighborhood policing. And if you need to escalate in terms of policing, you go into a totally different strand of policing. In the United States, policing is by coercion, right? Which is why every police officer is armed to the teeth and is frightening you, and therefore relations are very tense and intense. Now, in the countries that suffered post-industrial revolution colonialism, policing was expeditionary. It was policing for occupation. Now, as I was telling Saif here, in the Francophone countries, the police are called gendarmes. Now, if you speak French or understand French, break it down. It is gens d'armes, men in arms. People who are armed. Who are they armed against? My people. And that really is the notion, that was the notion of policing. The police were the first contact of the people with occupation. They were used to subjugate the people. And by the time independence arrived in the 1960s, you had over 100 years of expeditionary extermination of waves and waves of people, of generations. And then you had crystallized a doctrine, a regimental doctrine of policing that was anti-people, anti-race, anti-everything. That made it such that at the point of contact with what you call law enforcement here, you released a lot of energy that was combustible. And so that relationship was always a flashpoint. That flashpoint did not start today. If people in the United States became aware of it after George Floyd happened, that is their problem, not our own. And I think it is important that we recognize that. I've been a lawyer in an African country for 35 years. All I did, quite honestly, was I started off as a lawyer picking up dead bodies from mortuaries. That's all I know about. I don't know the number of dead bodies I have picked up from the mortuaries, but most of my clients over the period I did law actively were dead people, killed by the police, tortured by the police. If you inserted nails into their genitals, you had 6-inch nails inserted into the heads of people. They were popped, they were dead. You had nails inserted here, they popped through here. You had guns put here and everything blown out. These were my friends, these were my students, these were my people. It was horrendous. And so we went around trying to constrain this kind of policing. And yes, these were not being done by white folks. They were being done by people who looked like me, who were from my country, who were ordered by people who looked like me, who were from my country, and who claimed to be ruling my country. And as I went around the continent of Africa, it was the same thing. The narrative was not different. Why? Because the black body had been rendered insensate long before independence came. And the only thing independence did was change one pigment for the other without fundamentally transforming the value system that underpinned it. That fundamental transformation of the value system is really what we are talking about and what we are trying to engage with and what we've got to engage with. It's both political and ethical. And in addition to being political and ethical, you've got to engraft a time element to it, an intergenerational element to it. And so looking about it as a slice in time, or looking at it as a slice in time, begins to diminish it in a sense, because it does not capture the historical memory that frames it as each generation succeeds to that process of dehumanization. And that dehumanization, I guess, in many ways, a lot of people call it xenophobia. And so, for instance, when South Africans attack black people, they say xenophobia because the people being attacked look like they are not from South Africa. But that's not xenophobia. South Africans don't attack white people who are from outside South Africa. If they are attacking black people, it's not xenophobia, it's melaninphobia. It is hatred for the black pigment. That is different from hatred for the foreigner. And that, I think, so the loose use of language is itself quite problematic. You see, South Africans don't attack white people from Zimbabwe. They don't attack white people from Australia. No. They will not attack a white person who is naturalized as a Nigerian. No. They will not even attack a Lebanese who is from Sierra Leone. No. But if you're black from Zimbabwe, there is something just repulsive about you in South Africa. You need to be attacked. And sorry for making this noise, because that is what it is. Okay? If you are a black person from Botswana, you are fair game in South Africa. And you see it across the lot of our people, across the continent. And what is the problem? Colonialism hollowed out the anchors of identity and dignity that underpin the existence of a lot of people. It wasn't just, you were told you were worthless. Your identity was worthless. Your religion was worthless. And everything about you was worthless. And you could not even rule yourself. And so, and this is the note on which I want to end. You know, if you read Sam Nuyoma's autobiography, Where Others Wavered, Nujoma was the first president of Namibia. He tells the story of how he was told that black people could never rule themselves anywhere in the world. And so, challenged by that, he decided to trek from Ovimbunda land in Namibia, then Southwest Africa, to go and find anywhere in the world where black people had started ruling themselves. So he started walking to nowhere. And he walked and walked and walked, and he crossed boundaries and got into what was then Zimbabwe, or what is now Zimbabwe. And ultimately, the first country where he saw black leaders was in what is now Zambia, then Northern Rhodesia. And ultimately, he met with Kenneth Kaunda, who helped him to get, ultimately, finally, put him on a plane and got him ultimately to Liberia, where he got his first passport. Nujoma was the first president of Namibia, but his first passport was a Liberian passport. And he did that because he had the will to trek. Quite literally, he did not know where he was going. He was looking for a leader. This is a leadership problem at some level. And leadership here is both political and civic. And at different units of organization across the board, we've got to try and model successful civic organizing and political formations that make it possible for both diasporas and different countries of the black world to communicate in a way that is able to show that we are making progress in modeling, say, political communities that work. Political communities that can lead the reconstruction of this ethical system with with acute historical insights, but also show political values that have transformed this notion of the black person as incapable of anything other than that which colonialism and slavery have left behind. Let me stop there. I think I've taken up all of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Ardenkalu, for a very intense but very insightful talk, to say the least. Now, I feel like we focused a lot of the discussion about anti-blackness, and I do see a lot of value in understanding that history and that legacy that we currently are dealing with when it comes to anti-blackness. But just to shift the focus back to movements that are fighting that, including BLM or Black Lives Matter in the US, but of course that can take any other names in different languages across the world. And I wanted to ask you about what you think are some examples and also some impacts of such movements that have tried to fight anti-blackness or even potentially other forms of racism around the world. How have they been successful, and why did so much of those, or so many of those movements start or kind of get even more momentum after the US-based Black Lives Matter movement did get that momentum in 2020? Or why do you think so, at least?
Have they been successful? Or is that presumption? I think that's where we actually ought to begin. What does success for such movements mean? It seems to me that really is the question. What does success mean? And in that context, have they been successful? And you can talk about BLM here, NSARS was in Nigeria, Zuma must fall in South Africa, and all of those. But the 20th century, 21st century has been a sequence of failed, of false dawns in many ways. We thought the internet was going to be the beginning of freedom, like we have never known it before. Now authoritarians own it. We thought that the Arab Spring was the beginning of a new dawn of democratization in the Arab world. The authoritarians have reinvented themselves with it. We're not even going to go into what happened in Iraq or indeed in your country, in Tunisia. Zine Abdin and Leila Travelsi. And how they fled, and when they fled, all of us, were very happy, and then look at where we are, and we elected a law professor, right? And see where we are now in Tunisia. So, I was involved certainly in configuring NSARS, for instance, in Nigeria, because in an earlier generation, I had been involved at the heart of a different kind of movement, again around law enforcement with and against military rule. And when it started, I remember calling the young people together and said, you know what, I want to give you the benefit of my own experience, and I don't want you to be killed on my watch just because the issue is important and urgent. And knowing the law enforcement, they are going to kill you because you're all male and young. And so I said, look, let's start trying this thing out slowly. First of all, this started, so I said, look, let us start with getting you to safe spaces. And we modeled the protest over like 5 years before, and at that point I chaired Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission, and I told them, you know what, start with occupying Nigeria's National Human Rights Commission. I'll be there, no police officers will shoot you, because I could join you. But we create awareness with that. Then we roll it on, and we'll go and occupy the house of the Senate President. Why? Because if they kill you there, they'll be held to pay. Okay? So we started identifying safe spaces to do that, to model this in, so that people could get an awareness of the fact that young people were angry and things were going to escalate. By the time we got to NSARS, we were ready. But the political consequences of NSARS that's a different thing. And you're looking at them now. Nigeria just had an election, and the Nigerian election, basically all of the global noise about the Nigerian election was NSAS phase 3, which was what the young people who had been killed said, okay, they said we should not go to the streets, let us funnel our anger into the political process. And so they were running, and they found someone as their totem. And who was that? One man called Peter B. Okay? So they turned him into a hostage for their ambitions. And the system has done what? The system has subverted all of that. And basically, the outcome of the Nigerian election is a scandal. Not because of the numbers announced, but because of the way they were announced. They did not even make an effort to hide the fact that they were changing the numbers, the votes. Very manifestly, the returns, when you look at returns, polling unit after polling unit, Nigeria has 176,909 polling units. In pretty much every polling unit, results were rewritten. After results were collated, tallied, announced, they did what? They rewrote the numbers. Because they did not want the young people to win the political argument. And so I asked the question again, is that what is success? And my fear is that if you continue to have this, certainly on the African side, we are going to be looking at violence. And we're going to be because young people are going to be saying, well, you people don't want us to win the political argument. We are going to force things with the AK-47. And at that point, this will become a global problem, because the kids who are not fighting in the bushes will be crossing the Sahara into Europe and into the Americas. That would be a totally different story altogether.
Yeah, so I definitely echo this question of what success means. There are definitely instances of success on paper, right? Success by metrics that, we all see as like successful, including, for example, in Colombia, there's a Black land rights activist who was she actually fought like mining companies who were trying to exploit her community and displace her. And she, was engaged in Black land rights activism for decades, and she just won, she's vice president of Colombia today, Francia Marquez, which is, the first Black person even close to the presidentship in Colombia. Is that success? I don't know. Was Obama a success? I don't know, right? It's like one of those things of like black faces in high places. That doesn't necessarily solve the problems, right? And so I feel like, for me, a lot of what has been deemed as success are really like surface level sorts of approaches, right? Surface level measures, the DEI commissions, the government posts, and it's like until things have materially changed on the ground for Black people, I don't think that the movements have succeeded, right? And it's sad because one of the things that happens is that the machinations of anti-Blackness, they get recycled, redone, rephrased. So you have Black people in Colombia winning land rights in 1990s, which is a huge success, right? Just imagine if the US South became owned by Black people. Like, that would be, wow, right? That happened in Colombia. It was major. But now you have millions of people being displaced, right? Activists facing violence, being killed for their activism. So was that a success, or was that a success in the moment? So I think part of our task, if we're trying to really address anti-Blackness and achieve, and actually make Black Lives Matter, is that we have to learn how to deal with the backlash. We're always going to experience a backlash. Anytime there's progress, right, within white supremacist systems, you will face a backlash. How do you deal with the backlash? How do you keep moving despite the backlash? We're living in the backlash right now in the US, right? We're still in it. So I feel like part of what I want to see happen is more of a focus on grassroots organizing, more of a focus on mutual aid, more of a focus on community care, more of a focus on people on the ground, and not necessarily let's mobilize to get someone in the White House. Let's mobilize to get someone in Congress. That's important, sure, but is that actually changing things? if Congress is a white supremacist space, is that actually changing things to include black people in that space? And they have to assimilate to that space, right? So I guess that's where I stand on that issue. Yes, there's many examples, but the backlash is severe.
It sounds like, very rightfully so, you guys are pretty pessimistic.
No, I have hope.
No?
Oh
Okay.
gosh.
Then, well, I'm glad
I
you
wouldn't
do.
be here.
No, because my next question was going to be about hope. So, what hopes do you have, and what do you think the future of these kinds of movements hides, especially in these different regions that you guys work in? Because I do think it's you pointed out how in Africa these kinds of movements will use violence and will use AK-47s, and that is what it is, and it's not necessarily wrong sometimes, unfortunately. So how do you see these movements kind of grow? You mentioned Tunisia a lot. Actually, a version of the Black Lives Matter movement is happening right now in Tunisia because the president has had horrendous racist comments, speeches, even policies against migrants from West Africa. And perhaps the movement would not be called Black Lives Matter, it would be called Reminding Tunisians that we are African too, because we are racialized as white within our country for people who are not black, and so we have that like fake or illusion of whiteness and power that a lot of Tunisians today and policymakers are holding on to and using it against other people, right? And so I'm very happy that this movement is happening right now in my country against this racist kind of wave, but I'm also like, is it going to change anything? The policies are still being made and the people are still being, in many ways, oppressed, violated, and marginalized. So a short question would be, how do you see the future of these kind of movements be or look like?
So, yeah, I guess I want to reiterate, like, I do have hope. I do have hope. I think that, some folks say, like, hope is a practice, and I really take that to heart. Like, you have to actively work on hope. You can't just expect to be hopeful, because if you do, you are going to be depressed and sad all the time, because look at what's happening, right? There's so many examples of things to not be, like, hopeful about, to feel helpless around. I take heart in knowing that these movements, regardless of the backlash that they face, regardless of the issues on the ground, the violence they face, that they are spaces where people build community and where people rely on each other and lean on each other. And I think there's probably, a way that in the US, perhaps we don't see this. This is such an individualist, like, country, right? And so even thinking about community is difficult sometimes. Like, do you even know your neighbors? Do you even, like, no one knows their neighbors, okay? Like, this is a problem, right? So I'm hopeful because these movements do provide that sort of community, and we need community if we're gonna get anywhere. Even if it's awkward, even if you're socially awkward like I am, you need community, okay? So community is key. I think that, I'm sorry to say this, but capitalism is an incredible problem, right? If you are in a system where literally anti-blackness is tied to capitalism, how are you going to eradicate anti-blackness without eradicating capitalism? That is the problem that we are facing, right? Even if mentally, even if emotionally, we want things to be different. We say Black Lives Matter. At the end of the day, we gotta go and sell our labor for money. We have to go and profit off of other people's labor, or we don't have to do that, but people do that, right? The profit motive is always there. It's necessary for our survival. Now, if we relied on each other, right? If we did start to engage in mutual aid, more community-based, right, movements, then we wouldn't be as beholden, right, to capitalism as we are now. When we are individually siloed, it is a lot easier to exploit us. And that's where we are right now. Together, a lot harder to exploit us. That's why they don't want unions. That's why, we're seeing the unions to be developed. So there is hope because things are changing in some ways. It's just how do we manage the backlash and keep the momentum going? And I think that's where community is critical.
You know, you can't be in a university system without hope. Okay? No, after I've dealt in hundreds of dead bodies. And so after doing that and still standing, surely I have got to, you know, as I tell people, I sell hope. You know, that's the only commodity I know how to sell. And no, I'm pretty hopeful. But while selling hope, I think it's also quite important to be realistic. And you know, it's difficult not to be realistic in a world in which melanin is a burden. It is such a burden that actually there is a huge industry in skin whitening cream, right? And skin whitening cream is not just a huge industry. Heck, look, presidents indulge in it. The Congo Brazzaville is led by a man called Denis Sassou Nguesso. Denis Sassou Nguesso was a general in the French army, and he is a 4-star general in the army of his country. He's nearly 80 years old, and believe me, he spends a huge amount of his country's money on skin lightening cream. Okay? So we're presidents of supposedly black countries are actually spending hours every day trying to whiten their skin. So you know you've got a problem. And this is not an issue we can just hope our way out of. But, so having recognized that, are there examples that we can look at? No, the ANC in South Africa is a useful example, as bad as its current situation is. The ANC has actually started life in 1912 as a collective for the protection of a small black elite and the black chieftaincy cadre. For much of its life until Polokwane in 1955, the ANC was a very narrow organization. What changed the ANC was the vision of the ANC Youth League for turning it from that narrow entity into something that needed that could engage with a different kind of narrative in a different kind of world. And in that they built a coalition with the South African Communist Party at a time when communism was a 4-letter word, not law, obviously. Now, how they did that, because the SSCP saw the bigger picture, the relationship with the practice of production and the politics of how South Africa was organized. And so ideologically they were clearer, but the black South Africa had the constituency that SSCP did not have. And SSCP was a white organization, it wasn't black. And so ANC and SSCP went into a marriage in Polokwane in 1955 in a very simple sentence: South Africa belongs to all who live in it, whether you're white or black. That means what? You cannot have nativist or pigmented exceptionalism. That, I think, is very important. The skill of building confident collaborations in this, I think, is very vital. And I think that's one of the things we've missed. Because, okay, so because I am black, the only people I can mix with or do this business are black people. Or because they are white, no, they can't understand my problem. Like white people don't suffer too. You know, and of course the sufferings may be different, but it does not. And then of course there is no homogeneous white, right? There are ethnicities. And if you go into South Africa, you see the Greeks, the Portuguese, the Jews, the Anglo-Saxons, and every one of them has a different story and the Boers. Every one of them has a different story and a different experience of blackness. So if you look at the Boers, for instance, the Boers suffered concentration camps in the hands of the Anglo-Saxons in the Second Boer War. And they were decapitated, castrated, interned, destroyed. It was because of that that they founded the Broederbond in 1917 and ultimately got power in 1948. Without knowing that history, you will think, oh, these are terrible, terrible people. They were reacting to what they suffered. And I think it is important that we begin to learn to build cross-community collaborations. I think that's the lesson of the success of the ANC in rolling back white domination, apartheid in South Africa. I do think it is very important, and it's not just across communities in particular countries, but cross communities hemispherically across the world and cross continents. I think that is one of the places where we have got it wrong in trying to do this in silos of identity. And of course, on the African side, it means silos of nativism and silos of tribalisms and silos of ethnocentrism. That then breeds poison, which is actually anti-everything that we're talking about.
Thank you so much for both panelists. I will be moving on to, or we will be moving on to questions from the audience. So if you have a question, please use the microphone right there to ask your questions. Specify like who you're asking the question to. Is it for both panelists or one of them? Yeah.
Okay, good night. First of all, thank you so much for the amazing presentation. My name is Sergio. I'm an international relations student from Brazil, and my question is addressed to Mr. Rosalo. Okay, so in Brazil, there was a sociological concept called racial democracy, which is obviously a huge lie. There are claims that the colonial society produced a big amount of miscegenation, and due to that, all the races lives in harmony. So in other words, it says there is no racism in Brazil. I'd like to know that if there was any specific sociological or philosophical concept that helped to maintain the idea of harmony between races, and consequently the idea of absence of racism in Puerto Rico, Colombia, or other states in Latin America that you studied.
So can you repeat the first part of the question? I got the second part, right?
Okay, so the first part I said that there was a sociological myth, like sociological concept.
The question part, because you said, is there a sociological like concept?
Yeah, that helped to maintain racism in Puerto Rico or like
okay, so you just want me
countries.
to talk about like other places compared to Brazil?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I love talking about this because right, the main way that that racism or racial ideologies differ between the U.S. and Latin America is in the U.S. with racism being legalized, right, entrenched in the law with Jim Crow, there was a clear separation, right, between races, whereas in Latin America it was kind of like a let's just kind of mix together, but eventually with the end goal of whitening the population, right? We know this was like the underlying goal. So mestizaje, right, which is that concept in Spanish, it takes different forms in different countries, right? Mestizaje looks different in different countries. So in Puerto Rico, the way that people talk about mestizaje is the myth of the three roots. So no one is white, black, or indigenous. Everyone is white, black, and indigenous at the same time. Everyone is mixed. Okay, like I don't think so, right? Like on the ground, it's not true. But I interview Puerto Ricans and Dominicans that tell me this all the time, right? We're all mixed. We're all mixed. And then when I ask them, okay, how do you get read out in the street? Like, what do people think your race is? They'll be like, oh, most people think that I'm white, or most people think that I'm black. And it's like, okay, so you do understand how racism works. You do understand how appearance can be tied to the allocation of resources differentially. At least conceptually, you understand it, but you're not actually embodying it, which I think is not solidarity, right? I think that's a cop-out. I think that's a way of kind of absolving yourself of any accountability, responsibility for racism. So yeah, I think it looks absolutely different there. In Colombia, slightly different because the Black social movement has been so strong. So blackness is kind of like people talk about blackness, but then there's different types. It's very regionalized. One of the things that I see happening is that people will be like, oh, we just, say, like, we just talk about race in this way. Like, we call people negros all the time, and it's like, okay. But then the way that you actually experience racism on the street in, say, Bogota is incredibly different, right? Like, when people are yelling at you across the street, hey, negra, like, in an aggressive way, it's like, okay, when people are sexually assaulting black women in clubs, right? And saying things like, this is, like, this, you like this, right? Like, women like you like this, right? That's the sort of racism that happens in Colombia all the time, right? So it's a lot of similar things that we see in other places, but I would say that mestizaje in particular has different flavors, if you will. Thank you for the question.
Good night. First of all, I'd like to say that it was an amazing panel. And my name is Maria Antonia. I'm from Brazil. I studied in a law school there. And I was really, really interested about the concept of like recovering from anti-blackness effects. And I wanted to, like, my question is to Ms. Rosado, but both panelists can answer, please, because I want your thoughts on it. I wonder if there's that during your research you came across a legal concept of healing justice, because in Brazil I am doing a research about healing justice and how healing justice is helping black women to recover from being sexual violence assaulted, and I wonder if that's like a way that we can use the legal system to recover from the anti-blackness movement. So yeah, that's my question. It's a little bit of like just my thoughts, but I wanted to listen to you guys, like your opinions.
That's beautiful. I'm really jealous that y'all are working out of that. I'm telling you, Brazil is like, y'all are ahead of most, if not all, places in Latin America when it comes to these issues. So I'm just like, yes. So I would say that legally, we haven't gotten there, not in the US and not in the other places that, I've talked about. But this issue of, restorative justice in the US has gained a lot of traction. And I think restorative justice and reparative justice, truth and reconciliation processes in Colombia have been happening a lot. So there are attempts at it, but the closest that I would say I've seen is a concept that I use in my own work, which is emotional justice. And emotional justice, there's a book by Esther Arma, she coined the term. It's the idea that we all have work to do to heal the harms of racism. And then she kind of walks you through, like, if you are a black woman, here's the work that you have to do. If you're a black man, here's the work you have to do. If you're a white woman, here's the work you have to do, right? And like everyone has their own work to do, and then there's the work that we do together with each other. And that both of those pieces are critical. But a central part of what she's talking about is, one, that black people deserve to heal from anti-blackness. Two, that everyone should have a full emotional life, right? Because a lot of times in the US and across the world, black people's emotions are policed heavily. You're not allowed to be angry. You're not allowed to like talk about racism, right? So what does it mean to shift, to decenter whiteness, white people's feelings when we talk about emotions, right? What does it mean to decenter that and to center black and brown people, black and indigenous people in those conversations? I think is super critical.
What does healing mean?
I love the question.
If you, in basic physiology, yeah, even when you heal, you carry scars. And the scars remind you of things, and over time scars become your companions. And does healing, and I think we actually do have a right not to heal. I'd argue. Assuming we can clarify and come to an agreement as to what healing means. How, nobody tells the Jewish nation to heal from the Holocaust. Why do we have to heal? this is the question, what is the urgency of this healing business? That I quite honestly cannot understand. And it seems to me the one thing that the black folks do a lot is forgive and forget. And I think we have to stop forgiving and stop forgetting. And because we all do this forgive and forget nonsense, we tolerate a lot of bad government. You know, we allow people to abuse us who were abused historically, and the people who succeeded us are abusing us, and they will continue to abuse us. And we ask, because we're in search of healing. I refuse to heal. And I think, but those who want to heal are also entitled to go in search of healing. But, and this is what I'm reluctant about, the idea that everyone has to travel, every community has to travel the same trajectory. I do think people have to have choices in this matter, because different people's experiences of abuse are different. And whether it is in terms of the search for healing notionally, or in terms of what amount of time they need, or in terms of what will constitute healing for them, all of those things would vary depending on location. What I do know, therefore, is not necessarily experiences of healing, but the reality of intergenerational trauma. And there's a great deal of literature on intergenerational trauma and its consequences, and consequences of not recognizing it, of trying to shut it down. So that's the only thing I can add to that, that I am very suspicious of languages of healing, dialects of healing, because they promise you something that is actually not attainable, and quite often they pass the burden onto the victims to say, yeah, you know what, it is your responsibility to forgive. And in so doing, the perpetrator goes free, or perpetrators and their communities go free, which historically has been the course. You abolish slavery, what do? You paid off the slaveholders. When colonialism, when the British India Company was expropriated of the company right, they paid off the British India Company. When they expropriated, when the sovereigns of colonial powers succeeded to the companies that were doing colonial occupation, they paid off all of the companies. The victims never got anything. All we are offering them is heal. I refuse.
Can I ask a question just because you provoked me? What do you think about justice, like the concept of justice? How can Black people achieve justice through our legal system? And I'm asking broadly because I know every country has its legal system, but what is the concept of justice in your opinion?
I don't have any opinion of justice. I'm sorry, I'm not very helpful this evening, right? Yeah. But when you get justice, you would know. So I'm more in the realm of Bill Douglas here. Mm-hmm. That we recognize justice when we see it. And justice has got to come with an element of a guarantee of non-repetition. That is one acknowledgement. Two, guarantee of non-repetition that is genuine. And you're beginning to see some of that now. So the Dutch, the Germans, going back to Namibia and saying actually what we did was genocide against the Hereros. That comes close. It's not in the money. Yeah, people can get the money, but that is not the thing. Now the Brits hid a lot of their atrocities, and and they destroyed a lot of the files, as some of the work by Caroline Elkins down the road has shown. They destroyed a lot of the records of what they did. The Portuguese did as well, and the Spaniards absolutely. Now. And so the victims have not been able to establish or learn exactly what transpired. And it seems to me just being able to get that acknowledgement is bigger than any amount of compensation that you can give to people. Because it says, oh, you're not hallucinating. Actually, what you're describing did happen. And with a lot of victim communities, and particularly, again, this happens in a lot of sexual violence. We tell the victims of sexual violence that they're hallucinating. And for a long time, what happened? It was such that a victim of sexual violence could not testify to their being violated. They had to be corroborated by somebody else. That's how bad it was, because you are so low in the scale of human experience that you cannot be trusted to say what happened to you. And this is exactly what is happening with a lot of communities that have gone through this kind of violence. And that's really why I feel violated by languages of healing. That the first thing is to affirm your dignity. The radical element of every one of us is that dignity that says, you know what, this did happen. Until that happens, there is no justice.
Thank you. Obrigada.
Hello, my name is Danielle Gabizon. I'm from Haifa University. I study social work and I'm working with teens like for 6 or 7 years now. And a lot of them are suffering from black racism. And I wanted to ask you, how could I help them gain the trust in people and to feel a safe place to speak about their dreams, their needs, and feel that they are listened by me or by therapists.
Can you repeat the community that you're working with?
Teenagers, we have a lot of Ethiopians in Israel, they're the only dark-skinned people in Israel, so they suffer from a lot of racism.
The Falashas?
Also.
That's a long conversation. That's a very, very long conversation. Because there's also a lot of history to the experience of Israel's Falashas, the Ethiopian community that is now of Israeli nationality. And part of that history is very controversial. Part of that history is not fully acknowledged. And in this, therefore, we're also talking about, it's not just there are temporary mitigations, I think, that can be put in place for those who are working with that situation. But as well as that, there are then more long-term narrative issues relating to intergenerational trauma, and as I just spoke about. And it seems to me, I'm happy to engage with that dialogue one-on-one. And I actually do have 1 or 2 colleagues as well, or 2 students at Fletcher School who are related to this subject matter. We can all sit down and dialogue it much more fully if you're interested. I can give you my contacts for that purpose, please.
I'd be happy to.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, thank you for the amazing panels. They were awesome. My name is Renan. I am a law student in the University of São Paulo. And I am also a researcher in the Department of Philosophy and General Theory of Law. And I am studying currently some concepts of power and theories of power. And as Sif said in his second question, and I want to know some perspectives on hope and the future. So I believe you are familiar with the concept of necropolitical power by the Cameroonian Achille Mbembe, yes, the Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe. So as you stated, and we can see in Brazil, USA, Nigeria, the state violence against black people and minorities. I want to know your perspectives on the overcoming of this necropolitical power and of this necropolitical abuse, this political usage of power to kill and exterminate the people, the subjects of the state. So that's my question.
I feel like you probably have a better answer for this, but I'm gonna give it a shot. So I feel like one of the first things that we have to decenter is the idea of the nation state. So the creation of the nation state is relatively recent, right? This is not something that has existed forever. And it's a way of organizing people that kind of inherently means that some people belong and some people don't belong. Some people have full citizenship and some people don't, right? You have to protect the sovereignty of the nation state. You have to protect the borders. That involves violence, period, right? The state is really just a way of a legitimate use of violence, right? To protect the nation. So if we start unsettling the idea of nationhood, what does that actually mean? What does it mean to be a nation? What does it mean to be a citizen? Who's not a citizen, but on paper they are, right? What does their citizenship mean? What is their existence? What is their existence like, right? To be a Black person, I would argue, in most nation states, is to not fully be a citizen, especially if you're talking about places outside of the continent. And I would argue in a lot of places within the continent too, right? So what does that mean? If we unsettle that, if we stop taking the nation state as just an automatic given, right? That it's just the way that we organize ourselves. There are other ways that we can organize ourselves that are not the nation state. I'll leave it there.
I don't know whether I can give you a response to that is coherent at this particular hour. In 1968, Ali Mazrui, who is one of the most famous political scientists out of the African continent, wrote an article, a fairly popular article, on political assassinations in post-colonial Africa. And he argued that political assassinations in post-colonial Africa essentially were a response to two imperatives of the colonial transition. One was the imperative of integration between broad communities, ethnicities within a country, and the other was the imperative of political legitimacies, both legitimizing the state and legitimizing the authority of the post-colonial political elite. And in the mix of trying to work those out, you had a combustion in which violence was deployed by all sides. Ethnicities that did not accept the settlement, the post-colonial political settlement, deployed violence, and the post-colonial political leaders who emerged deployed violence and coercion rather than persuasion in order to assert their authority. And Achille, in my view, has kind of made the argumentation a little more sexy and a little more breathtaking with his notion of necropolitics. And when you look at places like Burundi, post the Burundi post 1966, or Rwanda 1959, 1972, 1994, DRC in the Eastern Congo, you will probably think, or indeed Sudan promptly went into conflict immediately after independence in 1956. My own country went into a civil war of near genocidal proportions 6 years after independence, or less than 7 years after independence, starting from 1967. And I am indeed a child of that war, having been born in internal displacement inside that war. Now, so when you look at that story, it sounds like, there's a coherent theory of necropolitics. But that's why universities exist, so that, intellectuals or academics can give fancy names to these things and then get tenure quite easily on the back of that. But I think the issues are a lot more complicated than calling it necropolitics. There are fights. You can easily disaggregate the stories. If you're talking about the Congo, for instance, you cannot talk about necropolitics in Congo as if the Congo started in 1960, or Rwanda, Urundi, because to understand the Congo, you've got to go back to King Leopold. You've got to go back to Berlin in 1885-86. Without that, you cannot. To understand Nigeria, you've got to go back to at least 1936, to the alteration of the internal borders and the settlements that created internal domination between one part of the country and the other. Those were not done by the people now being accused of necropolitics. And if you're talking about necropolitics, the people who pioneered it have long left the territory, but created mechanisms that have continued, that have made more likely the extermination of the people who live within those territories. So, I mean, Ashil is my good friend. Necropolitics is not language I would necessarily use. There are dialectics and dynamics at play that do not, in my view, lend themselves easily to that kind of language. I have seen atrocity. I am a child of atrocity. I live with atrocity. I argue against atrocity. I'm in court in different parts of the continent arguing against atrocity. So don't get me wrong here. I'm not trying to minimize atrocity. I'm chasing presidents because of atrocity. But I do think that sometimes, getting caught in these interesting turns of phrase may be useful for universities, but don't much help beyond the ivory tower. But again, I'm willing to engage in dialogue beyond here on that subject matter, so that we can disaggregate the narration and examine the different countries and the realities. I was evacuated from Sierra Leone in 1998. In January 1999, 6th of January 1999, I was evacuated under fire from Sierra Leone. I ran away to Guinea-Conakry, right? And in Sierra Leone, I cannot tell you the atrocities I witnessed. But you see, you cannot, I still have money stuck in Sierra Leone that I can never recover, but when you need to understand the history of Sierra Leone to understand what has transpired in the country, or the history of Liberia, and the relationship between American-Liberians and the natives, to understand some of the venom that has been let off in some of the things that have gone on in the country. So that's why I'm a little bit leery about some of the expressions.
Thank you very much.
Go for it.
Are you sure? Yeah. Are we running out of time? Last question?
Last question. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Saif, and thank you, professors, for that really engaging lecture series that you gave. My name is Caitlin. I go to Tufts, and I'm part of the EPIIC class. And in April, we'll be hosting some Model UN conferences for high school students, and the theme of that conference will be reparations. And that's what I'm curious about. We'll be talking about reparations in all sorts of forms. And both of you touched upon capitalism and how that privileges capital owners and inheritors of generational wealth. And I believe that reparations is or was on the NAACP agenda. And of course, it's highly relevant to many countries in Africa, but in a very particular way, depending on their specific relationship to genocide or colonialism or slavery. So I'm just wondering, what thoughts either of you might have on the role that material or tangible reparations can play vis-a-vis Black people around the world or Black nations.
I'll go first and give Professor Rosado the last word of this. Reparations, in my view and experience, isn't about money or something tangible. It's about things that money cannot buy. And my grandfather always told me, my grandfather was a paramount chief, he always told maternal, that anything money can buy is not valuable, because it's not invaluable, because you know how much it is worth. Right now, the international movement for reparations, I think it was more for acknowledgement than any other thing. And we're beginning to see that now. The Dutch have acknowledged, and so nobody's taking them to court and said, okay, this is how much you're going to pay. But in acknowledging, they have come to a computation of what they could do to begin to assuage, to expiate. Now, the Germans have done the same, but I think the biggest act of reparations that we're seeing now is in
The only thing I wanted to add to that, because that was amazing. The only thing I wanted to add is that reparations is about repair, right? It's supposed to be a process of repair. How can you repair something that's still happening, right? I feel like that's a critical issue. Is like, even if tomorrow, let's say by some miracle, the US decides that it's going to pay all US descendants of slavery X amount of money, and now they're on parity with whites in the country in terms of socioeconomic status, that will not eliminate anti-Blackness, right? That's not going to repair the harms that, Black Americans have faced in this country. So how do you achieve repair, right? How do you achieve repair? Despite being very anti-capitalist, I do think that material things do matter, right? Because we still live in this system, right? People are dying because of lack of money now. So yeah, I do think that people need money, but ideally, the end goal is not just the money. The end goal is to stop the harm, because the harm hasn't stopped. And I think that's part of the problem, is that we're acting as if this is in the past and not acknowledging that it still lives with us today. So stop the harm first, then work on repairing it. That's my take on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor.
Dr. Rosado and Professor Odinkalu for having this panel, making this panel happen with me. Thank you so much for the audience, for your amazing questions, and for showing up at 7 p.m. on a Friday. Thank you.
Hello.